Hi, everybody. Good evening. Good evening to everyone across broadcast land. This is EduTALK. This is Tuesday evening. This is also Black History Month in the African diaspora. And we are featuring another episode of Black History. And in this time, we're looking at the crisis in Black education as it relates to the conversations around Black history. And we want to look very briefly about some of the nuances in the education of Black people, mostly because we are talking about the Caribbean region, the Americas. We talk a lot about how Black people in the Western Hemisphere is affected by some form of policy or discrepancy with as it relates to the historical events happening from one generation to the next. It's very similar to generational trauma, but instead of generational trauma, is educational trauma that Black people are faced with in terms of their history, our history. So on the program today, we have Dr. Noel Gordon and as well Dr. Judy Villeneuve-Dyce. Dr. Noel Gordon is an educational consultant and he is also an author of the book You Come First. And we have Dr. Judy Villeneuve-Dyce is my partner in crime. She is co-founder of ESI and also the one with the money bag, as they say, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. Welcome to the program. We're going to get started in with our concept here, the crisis in Black education. What constitutes Black education? Because when I first saw that, I'm like, Black education, shouldn't it be just education? But we have white education? And what does that entail? Because it might not be labeled that, but it does have some European twist to it. What is Black education? Judy, you want to go first? I think you're muted.
Yes. Well, thank you again. It's a really a pleasure to be on with both of you doctors and to have such an important conversation about what obviously is very at the heart of everything that we do, right? We're all in education in some capacity or another. Um, Now, obviously, education is for a purpose. Typically, education is something that we want to ensure that our young people have so that they can be empowered to be uh, productive citizens. And what does that mean? That means very different things for very different people, right? Depending on the resources that they have access to, the society in which they're in, and the opportunities that are available. Education can look very different depending on what group you fall into. So when you talk about Black education in particular, when I hear that statement, what I understand is that there is a unique need that students of color, people of African descent, and those people who are qualified as minorities in the United States, if we're speaking about that, they have different hurdles to overcome. And in the education that they need, very specifically, we need to ensure that they get those resources so that they can, in fact, be able to live their best lives, right? Be able to attain the American dream, be able to meet their capacity of potential. And so it's going to look very different for someone with low income or first generation American or first generation national, in the United States. And so, yes, I do believe there is a type of Black education that exists. Unfortunately, it's necessary in order to prepare our children who are, in fact, Black students in America.
Okay. Dr. Namagan, do you think Black education is a real thing?
It should not be. It should not be a real thing. And that is a judgment on the educational system. Education is education, but then there is the issue of access and equity. Sometimes the access is there, but the equity is not in place. And that's precipitated by a number of problems, like poverty and socioeconomic factors, lack of representation and diversity in education, implicit biases and systemic I know in the United States it's systemic racism, but I think in the Caribbean it's more classism. Some folks object to that, but I believe that based on your class and also based on your color, you have white privilege and you also have brown privilege, and also parental involvement and community involvement. So because of these variables, you find that education is not equitable across the board. And unfortunately, Black people usually are the ones who are at a great disadvantage as it relates to education. That should have not been the case, but it is a fact and we need to talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's the way that we formulate the educational processes for our people. Then we could label it as one thing. It's Black education or whatever education. How would you compare that with education? Like we said, we want to decolonize education in the Caribbean or the Americas for people of color, or Black and brown people. Um, does that make it Black education then if we're decolonizing education? What do you think, Judy?
No, I don't think it's that at all. I think it's a more inclusive education, and in the fact that what we have had in the Caribbean and across the United States is an education about history of people coming from Europe. That's been the primary history. Something that's celebrated Greek history. There's a lot of Europeanized history that are celebrated in the education. And so, unfortunately, what has been happening, many of our Black and Brown students, let's say those of Native American backgrounds, are only taught about the fact that they lost their land and, that they lost the fight for their territory, right? And then Africans, descendants are told that they were, in fact, just laborers. What I believe would be very helpful and inclusive in an education, not just decolonizing it per se, although that's the catchphrase right now, but if we were to include a more complete perspective about education, what the different Native Americans that were living not only throughout the United States, but the Americas all the way up until the Polynesian Islands. I mean, all of these are Native American people, and the people that we label as Mexican right now, these are all originally Native American people. They have a really rich history that we don't get to appreciate because that's not integrated into our educational system. And as well as the Africans, the Moors, all of the wonderful things that they did throughout Europe and the world, and as explorers. This is not part of that education. So I believe that in the decolonization of education, it isn't making it a Black education. It's making it a more comprehensive and complete education about different nationals from around the world so we can all appreciate each other and our histories.
You know what I really dislike is to have somebody getting up, like a history teacher, getting up and saying that, let's look at the history of Black people, world history, world history. Let's look at world history and look at Black people's history and say, let's start from the 13th century. And then you wonder, why are you starting there? Why not start in the 5th century? Because you could start with the history of Islam. Start with the history of Islam. And in the 5th century, right? When Islam started in the 5th century. And you could get a lot of history for Black people, going more comprehensive history of people. And if you track the foot track of the spreading of religion, you can get a lot of history from that, just teaching the history of religion, especially the Muslim religion, Islam. All right, Dr. Gordon, you want to talk about the root causes of the crisis for Black education?
Yes, and I so concur with Dr. Dice, Mrs. Dice, Dr.
Yeah,
Dice,
excited.
all that you just said a while ago. And the crisis has to do with the antiquated approach that we take towards education. For instance, the agrarian society, going back to the Caribbean, students were taught to work, to be an employee, to maybe work the farms or to work in the factories, and they were not taught to do critical thinking. They were not taught they were not taught to balance a checkbook. They were not taught to understand that, hey, you can start a business and you can become successful. And because of this mentality, you find that we do not prepare our students to solve problems. Please note that people are paid to solve problems. The individuals who make the most money in our society are the individuals who are paid to solve problems. So as I said, the poverty and the socioeconomic situation is a factor. Let me give a little bit of statistics, and that is more confined to the United States, but it also goes across the globe. A high school graduation rate for Black students is 76% on the average compared to 88% for white students. Black students are more likely to attend underfunded school, with 44% of Black students attending schools with high poverty rates. And this came from Education Trust reports. The achievement gap between Black and white students, with Black students scoring on average of 27 points lower than on the NAEP. I administered a NAEP when I was the director of testing for my school district, the National Center for Education Statistics, which tests your educational acumen. Black students perform poorer than white students. And also Black teachers, they make up only 7% of the teaching force, despite Black students of 15% of the population. So what we find is that we have to revisit our hiring practice. We have to revisit how we teach our students to go out into society and to be successful. Poverty and socioeconomic disparities can limit access to quality education and resources. So I think one of the major problems that we have is access, and we have to find a way of providing access to our students in equity.
Yeah, you mentioned something very important, the hiring practices, and with, the problems that they're having now with following DEI and the rolling back of DEI policies, or even tapping into civil rights. When you look at DEI, let's take out DEI out of the equation for a little bit and talk about representation. You know, representation. If you take the school system, for example, from the 1960s, 70s, leading up to now, you don't need a master's degree to find out that the practices of educational practices were going downhill for Black and brown students in America since integration in America. And that follows with the reduction in the number of Black teachers who are in the classroom. The number of white teachers actually increased, and the number of Black teachers actually decreased all the way from the 1970s to the 1990s, let alone the 2000s. You have more white women in education in America than Black women, and more white women are mothering, are teaching our Black and brown sons than Black women who are mothering our students. And who know best to mother students than their mothers, their actual mothers, who know best to actually train them to wear a tie than our Black fathers, who know best our upbringing than our Black family. Our Black family is a beautiful sight to see, going out to churches, going out to events in our society. It's really beautiful to see them in their Black suits and their Black ties, Black tie events, and nice shiny shoes that they're going out with the family, So we take that and push it into a system that is built on prejudice. Then you find that we need representation in our system. In our system, that we see representation. In my capacity as a teacher of color, I've seen that I've impacted students on a really magnificent scale compared to other teachers, hands down. And it's not because of my personality. Of course, I'm charming, but it is because of representation. Can you talk a little bit about representation in terms of education, Judy?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, honestly, I'm first generation American. One of the things that I think I can share is that the education that I received from my mother and my family is very different than what I was getting in the classroom. So you've spoken about a lot of things that that gave me ideas. This idea that all of your education comes just from the school in which you're in is problematic, right? Obviously, for many reasons, because we don't control who is teaching our children. We don't control the curriculum that goes into the teaching of our children. Whereas in the society that you kind of were speaking about in the past, or in our very intimate foreign countries, when our families are involved and the church is involved, and there are communities that are helping to influence our children and teach them the values that we want them to replicate, that is also an education. It's a very viable education. It's extremely important. And you'll see in other communities, like the Asian community, South Asian and North Asians, they have after-school programs. They have weekend programs where those children are not only learning about their own culture, but they're learning the language, they're learning what's expected of them, and they're reinforcing their cultural identity and pride. Now, this becomes very important because it's identity and pride that motivates children to want to learn, and it's the parental and family involvement that motivates them to want to learn. So when you talk about families, and you can look at separately but not apart from the fact that a lot of the Black families are bifurcated and broken, that all of the things that you've mentioned that would reinforce that pride and that learning and that desire to be able to move forward in the society and to overcome hurdles that might be in their way, and sources for learning are not available, unfortunately, a lot of Black and brown families. So we have a problem with it's not just within the school system itself, but it's in the community at large. And the Caribbean has the advantage of being among themselves and being invested in their students' learning, and as if they were extensions of their own family. And you see that when you go to the schools in the islands. And that can't exist here because the society doesn't allow for it. But I can definitely attest to, Dr. Dyce's reach for the students that he has been able to teach. And yes, it does have a lot to do with your personality as well. Not only excellent teaching, but also the fact that you bring a different perspective. And you said put DEI aside, but DEI has a lot of labels that are kind of negative, but the positive thing out of it that I can say is that when you bring people that are diverse into an educational institution and they get access to new information, it helps everybody to grow. It helps all the students and the families to grow. And I've definitely witnessed that with the work that you're doing, Dwayne. And I know that would be the impact that it would have everywhere. But like you said, the majority of teachers teaching Black and brown students are white women, and they come in with their biases, implicit or explicit, and they have complete and access to the children exclusively from their parents for many hours a day, work days and longer. And so their influence is very, very massive and critical into developing those students. So we really, really need to look at, well, where does education happen and how can we create those opportunities within the school system and outside of it?
Yeah. Noel, what can you say about addressing the achievement gap? Because we do have achievement gap, and you alluded to it earlier. Achievement gap in our black and brown students. You talk about graduation rates, and those of them who are actually gaining achievement. They're actually academic achievement compared to white students. Where do we address this achievement gap among our Black and brown students?
It's all about the pedagogy. It's all about the teaching and learning process. It comes back to the educators. It comes back to what are we teaching our teachers as we train them in our various institutions? Are we training them just to do the math and the English and the science and the social studies? Or are we training them to take what we call in New Jersey a comprehensive approach in addressing all the needs of our students? I beg to share this. I taught in Patterson School District. Patterson is an inner city school district. And I find that even some of our Black teachers, Black female teachers, even though they have the skin color black, many of them are amazing teachers, but some of them are very harsh on our own students, especially on our boys. So I think that we have to prepare our teachers adequately in the various tertiary institutions so that they can understand that it's not a joke. A number of things we want to take into consideration. The teachers should be taught to create a safe, inclusive, and culturally responsive learning environment that values and affirms Black students' identities. Whether it's in America or in Jamaica, we have to identify what we need to place on the plate so that students can be validated and they can provide high quality instruction and support that meet the unique needs and experiences of different kinds of students. Because in the Caribbean, especially countries like Jamaica, you have the uptown and you have the downtown and you have the country and you have the deep rural. So we have to take that eclectic approach in addressing these needs. They can serve as role models, mentors, and advocates for Black students, helping to build their confidence and their self-esteem and their academic motivation. They can work to dismantle systemic barriers and biases in education, because they do exist, advocating for policies and practices that promote equity and justice. And by taking on these roles, teachers and educators can help create a more supportive and inclusive and educational system for minority students. So it comes back to our teachers. And educational leaders have to understand that you're not just a manager. You're not just there to manage teachers we need to do, and I alluded to that in one of our past presentations, clinical supervision is of paramount importance. We have to be in the classrooms. As educational leaders, we have to look at the teaching practices of our teachers. And when we evaluate them, we have got to be objective in our approach to evaluation. And we have to find out the weak points, the weak links in the chain. And we have to provide proper professional development for our educational staff. And make sure that we supervise, because what we examine is what we really get as a result. So in a nutshell, we have to work on our educators, make sure that they're adequately trained, because we have no control over what happens at home, but we have control over what happens in the school system. And if we come together with this collective approach, and what you're doing with this organization, I want to commend you, because what you're trying to do is to provide professional development across the board, across the Caribbean, not just one or two countries, and not just across the Caribbean, but across the world, which will impact our practice and help us to hone our craft as educators.
Yeah, yeah. So if we target educators and we're looking at the school system now, and we're winding down our program, briefly, I want you guys to think about this and comment. If the school system is shutting down and shut its doors towards accurate history, teaching of history, accurate, what are families to do about that? If we're talking to families from the airwaves, like what we're doing, and we're saying our school systems are failing our Black and brown students, history is really under attack. Accurate teaching of history is under attack. What can families do about it? What do you think, Judy?
This is a historical practice, and it's done across countries for generations. I happen to have a friend who was Japanese, and of course the Japanese gave the Chinese a difficult time, and she didn't understand what she had done, what Japan had done to China, because it was never taught to her. And so when she met her first Chinese national, who communicated to her that she actually hated Japanese, she really honestly didn't know why. And what was done in Japanese education was to wipe out the negative history of things that they had done to people and when she was being taught in school. So the fact that this is happening in the United States, it's very common. It's a common political practice. But for those of us who, and now we have access to the internet in ways that we haven't before. And I have to say, people of African descent in particular, and other nationals, have never been been as quote unquote woke as they are now, the amount of information about Black history is so prevalent. I mean, as long as you do a couple of searches, AI will give you more. I mean, it's an amazing amount of information out there. So what we need to understand, I guess, is despite the fact that education in the formal education institutions are in some states, not all. New York isn't doing that. We're very big on education about all cultures, but in places like Florida, of course, where this is happening, it would be strongly recommended that those families take the time to build family, to build community between themselves, and to do their own research. The education is available. It's out there. It's in libraries. It's online. There's no reason not to know, but we do need to make a concerted effort. It's not a passive education that we need to have at this point. It's got to be proactive, and we have to go out there for it because it's deliberately being denied a lot of people. They need to get up, stop shopping online, stop surfing the web, and actually do what they need to do to empower themselves, to educate themselves. They'll build self-esteem, they'll build pride in not only themselves as adults as they learn these things they've never heard about, but in their children. And that's the only way to really empower them for a successful future in the society.
Yeah. Dr. Gordon, what do you think?
I think that it takes a collaboration between the policymakers and the community. Policymakers and community leaders must collaborate to create systemic changes, and policymakers can work with community leaders to develop and implement policies that address the root causes. First of all, we have to address the root causes for this crisis, because if you don't know what causes a problem, you won't be able to solve it. And then community leaders, whether it's in the United States, we're very active NAACP, in the Caribbean, we have to form these community. We need to have education forums in every community in the Caribbean and across the world. They can provide critical feedback and guidance to the policymakers, ensuring that policies are informed by the experiences and the perspectives of Black students and their families. And things don't just happen out there in abstract. And together, policymakers and community leaders can advocate for increased funding and resources to support Black education. And finally, they can also work to build partnerships between schools, community organizations, and local business to provide wraparound support and services for our students. The bottom line is that we owe it to society. We owe it to our society to leave this world a better place. And when you go out there and you start a business and you're making some money, give some back to the community. So we basically have to become activists. I heard Mrs. Dice, Dr. Mrs. Dice, your wife, I get it right. You alluded to us basically to become proactive and intentional. Right now, we can't sit back. We need to start our own schools. You know why we have charter schools in this country? When they had the desegregation, these people went out and started their own schools for their own children. We always want to integrate. I want to tell you something, that integration is not necessarily the answer. I worked in a school district in Patterson where it was basically minority students across the board. And then I worked in another school district, not the one I'm currently working in. I worked in another school district where you have a majority, you have lots of whites and you have lots of Black. And some of the problems that we were faced with was the disparity. And many of our students, they develop low academic self-concept, etc. So if you think that, let us integrate, we need to take our future into our own hands. And I hope that we can allow this thought to resonate among the peoples of the world, among the minority people across the world, understand what's happening in our society. Education is going to get to the place where you can't afford it. But if we pull our resources together and people like us who have been through the system, if we can assist them to make sure that we take care of our own.
Take care of your own. That's it. Thank you so much, guys. Dr. Noel Gordon, Dr. Judy Villeneuve-Dyce. Thank you for being on. We're going to come back on again with another episode. We're looking at integration and segregation. Do we have some good in those two words there coming from the 1960s and 70s? Should we have integrated,
I
or should we
preempted you. I'm sorry, I preempted.
Yeah, yeah. We'll see you. Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. Guys, this has been EduTalk. We really enjoyed your time. Please write to us at edusolutionsintl@gmail.com. That's edusolutionsintl@gmail.com. Or just Google us and you'll find us on the web, Education Solutions International. That's Education Solutions International. Or if you want to visit our website, edusolutionsintl.org. That's edusolutionsintl.org. This has been great, and I hope you learned something from everybody here at this table, the virtual table. We'll see you next week, and make sure you do something that you do right for our Black ancestors, because this is Black History Month. Do something for your ancestors. Don't just leave them turning in the grave. Do something. Bye, everybody. Take care. Walk good.
Take care. Bye bye.